I'm Jonathan Weinberg, and this is Drawing with Fountain Pens. Today, we're continuing a series of discussions with wonderful people in the pen community, and it is a great privilege to have Joshua Lax, who is a nib Meister, with us. You're going to introduce yourself, I
Sure.
understand. Yeah.
So again, my name is Joshua Lax. I'm the proprietor of the JJ Lax Pen Company, and I specialize in nib modifications and nib repairs. In addition, I'm a lawyer. I've actually been something of a teacher at one point. I technically still am. And I've been a fountain pen acquirer and collector since about 2009 at this point. So it's kind of crazy to say 16 years in the fountain pen world.
Well,
Um,
let me just also say that we're joined today by Andrew Wong, who's become like a co-host with me in these interviews.
Yes. Another
Dr.
fountain
Wong.
pen aficionado. So happy to be here and getting to know the fountain pen community, which is just as rewarding as using fountain pens. So I'm happy to be here and really happy to see Josh Lax here. He took care of a few of my pens over at the New York Pen Show. One of my Mont Blanc 149s um, that wasn't working well, and he brought it to life. So, yep, this one right here. Thank you very
Very
much.
Magic.
good.
Just magic, simple magic.
Tell us how you began this journey, as they say, of not being into the fountain pens.
So I'm going to level with you, gentlemen. I was prepared to tell you kind of a wild yarn that was full of fabrications, and I've
It's
been working on
okay.
it all day, and it just isn't what I want it to be. So we're not going to talk about it. It was going to start like, well, it was after the war, and then I couldn't get it right after that. So I'll tell you the real story. The real story is that I basically acquired too many pens. That's what it comes down to. I was, as I said, my wife got me, well, I didn't say this part, but as I said, I started getting into fountain pens in 2009. Before that, my wife had gotten me an Acme rollerball and I started using it. I carried it around. I did like a law school clinic in law school. I was like carrying it with me all the time. Felt super cool. And what ended up happening was I decided after I started working properly that I wanted to get a fountain pen from this company. So I got the pen. I remember that I have it still, but the artist that Acme used for that design was Ben Hall, so it had kind of like a superhero kind of riff. And I got the fountain
Superhero was
pen
it?
version of it, and it stopped writing. Sorry.
Which superhero was it? DC or Marvel?
His design for this was sort of like a generic superhero. Like if you bought like, how to draw comic book superheroes at a Barnes and Noble or something, it kind of looked like the proper version of that.
Right.
Um, and I liked it. I liked it. I thought it was cool. So what I ended up doing was I got the fountain pen version of that. You could get it as a roller ball. It's really just an attachment that screws, there's a roller ball front and a fountain pen front. I had the fountain pen front, but it stopped writing. And at that point in my life, I didn't understand why would it stop writing. I thought fountain pens, stay inked up and ready to go forever. So I ended up going online and trying to find out some information about what was happening. Very quickly, I realized it dried out. I don't even know, it seems so obvious now. I don't even know like what kind of information I encountered. But nonetheless, I ended up going online and just wandered into like whatever I think it was Fountain Pen Network at the time was like the hotspot for
Hmm.
Fountain Pen fandom. I know it's sort of gone way more diffuse now that there's so many different platforms, but this was the days before Instagram. This was the days before Reddit, obviously. And
When was this? What year was this?
this would have been so I graduated law school in 2008 and I started like actually working for real in 2000. Like I had like an actual, I was like in a firm and it was at that point, so I'm pretty sure it was 2009.
Hmm.
Um, and then from there, I started discovering all this stuff online. Now, unfortunately, but also fortunately, I'll admit, this was at the time that we were coming out of, that we being the United States and the world economy, we're coming out of the mortgage crisis. And so, unfortunately, that put the nail in the coffin for a lot of businesses of various sorts. Fountain pens at the time were going out of fashion. And so you could find tremendous deals like all over the place on various, particularly modern pens. I wasn't yet into the vintage pens, but that's going to play a role in a second. So, I acquired a bunch of steel nib pens, mostly mediums and broads, and I just had them. Now, I was going strong. I helped found the pen club in New York City with some folks. Um, it was great. And at some point, I started to get exposed more and more to the vintage side of things, and I became interested in that. And so I acquired some vintage pens. Tim Ettenheim, who you both may know, kind of showed me how to resack an Esterbrook and just get it working
Mhm.
again. So he did that, but I wanted to learn more. And so in 2012, I signed up for the Richard Binder Vintage Pen Restoration Masterclass. So anyway, so I ended up doing this masterclass in vintage pen restoration. I learned a lot. I still use a lot of the information I got.
And was that
But
like was that like a several days or was that a
yeah, it was like a 4-day thing. You go
oh
up to New
wonderful.
Hampshire, you stay, near where Richard lives. You go
Well,
to his
this is
house
so
every
cool.
morning and you learn the basics of a whole myriad of fountain pen restoration. Now, I will tell you, there's some things I just never really started doing. Like I understand what has to happen, but I never actually practiced it. And obviously, we didn't cover every pen, but there were just things you needed much more elaborate tooling for, like a standing drill press and a metal lathe and things I just couldn't fit in my apartment in Brooklyn at the time. So I did things I could do, but I just didn't really mature into some master fountain pen restorer. Now,
Hmm.
after a little bit, I, was sort of looking over the whole breadth of my collection and I said, I have way too many steel nib pens that kind of write all the same, and it's going to cost me a fortune to go and pay somebody to modify all of these things. And so as a result, I ended up um, contacting Richard and telling him I want to learn the other thing he does, which is the nib work. We got a little bit of it when we were there, just, sort of like the basic smoothing and adjustment skills, but I asked to learn more. So basically, what I essentially did was he gave me notes and then he had me like I would go to a show he was at in the Northeast or something, and I would sort of shadow and watch, and he would show me things, and then I would practice on my own. And I did this for a while. I did it all on my own pens. And then at some point, one of my fellow Big Apple Pen Club members, her name's Wendy. She no longer lives in New York City. I think she's in Florida now, but she encouraged me to do this for other people. So in 2016, I got my first table at the Long Island Pen Show. I went in there, started doing it. There was a few bumps in the road. I got some advice from Richard. Then I started I would go to the pen club every month and do nib smoothings and adjustments. People would give me incredible things to work on. And, I just worked myself into it from there.
So you were
So
kind of an apprentice to Richard in a way.
I would not say that I was an apprentice. I would say that I learned things from him. He had an
Yeah.
actual, Linda Kennedy is more sort of in the apprentice
Okay.
spot. Jim Bear was, I think, actually going up to Richard's shop regularly and helping him when he was in business
Hmm.
do like work for people. So that's how I got into all of this.
He mentored
I
you.
still practice law. I was in a 4-hour meeting with a client yesterday, and I wrote with a fountain pen the entire time.
Oh, I
Last
wondered
week,
that
same
if
thing.
you still did the law, you're still a lawyer.
Yeah. The
What kind
one
of
thing
law
I
do
would
you
say,
do? What kind of
what?
law do you do?
So I do a lot of criminal defense in federal court. Like you've
Oh.
heard of the NBA case, like the basketball players who are involved with the mob and gambling and all this
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
Yeah,
yes, I've
big
So I
heard
one.
was in
that.
court. I have a client in that case. And
In general, one of the things I was moved when Richard did his little, the nib, what would you
yeah,
call it, little workshop, that he really talked about how important it was for him to sort of get the message out,
yeah,
to get people like yourselves and to sort of share the knowledge because that's really saving fountain pens. It's an
yeah.
incredible It's an incredible thing that you're doing.
If
So,
I
so
can just one before we move on, if I could just say one
oh,
last thing about the lawyering
right.
part before we go deep into the fountain pen
Right.
aspect of it, but this is connected to fountain pens. So I have an issue. You were asking me if I still practice law. I was about to say this. So I go into the jail. I go into jails to meet with people,
Hmm.
like fairly regularly. And you're in the jail, like you never know what's gonna happen. So I
Right.
like want to bring fountain pens in there. So I like very specifically think about which fountain pens I bring into the jail with me. Because one, I don't want to get it confiscated because it looks too crazy for them. Two, I don't want it like getting lost in some like weird shuffle that
Right.
might happen. So can I show you one of the fountain pens I bring to
Sure.
jail?
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that I've had, let me say without going into too much detail, I've had experience visiting people, very close people in my world
Okay.
in jail, and I'm kind of surprised that they would let you bring a fountain pen into the jail.
So let me talk you through it. So this is the Moonman. I forget what model it is, but
Okay, well, we can look it up.
it's the knockoff of the Parker 25.
Yes, yes, which was designed by, I did a whole thing about it. Kenneth Grange,
Yeah, no, they're wonderful pens.
designer.
I have the
Beautiful.
original ones, like they're great.
They're great.
But this is a pretty decent pen. And I think I got it, it was like $6.
No, they did a really remarkable job.
Yeah. So one of the things is the nib is not that large on it, and that I think
Ah,
helps. So it doesn't really look like, because I've gone into the courthouse before and they x-ray my bag and they're like, "Do you have
okay.
like some sort of like tools in there, like some sort of cutting thing?" And it's because they see the nib and it looks,
Yeah,
this looks much more like, a ballpoint. You're allowed to bring fountain pens in. Um, I brought I usually bring inexpensive stuff just because it gets knocked around. I'm not allowed to bring much in to begin with, so like I'm not gonna bring a pen case in there and have
no, no, no,
it.
no. It's
There
interesting.
there is a translator I see in the jail because sometimes people you bring a translator with you to help you with
Right.
clients.
Yeah.
He writes with a Lamy Safari fountain pen. Like I've seen
Oh,
him
there you
making
go.
notes. So I've never spoken to him
Cool.
about it because he's usually busy, but I'm always
No,
like,
but that's cool.
"Hey, my fountain pen brother."
The one thing you sort of glossed over very quickly
hmm
is you never really said, well, what was so exciting about fountain pens? I mean, why did you
Ah,
suddenly start writing with fountain pens?
so I I think so. I had like before I got that Acme, I had a Muji pen, like the
Okay.
Muji aluminum one, and I used it when I was studying for the bar. Like we would go
Right.
every day to like a bar review class, and they would have like a thing where you were filling in like worksheets essentially to kind of digest the information. And what ended up happening was I had it and I switched into Mont Blanc ink cartridges because like I went to a stationery store and that's what they sold me. And I just stopped using it because the ink was bleeding too much into the paper because it was cheap
Right.
workbook paper.
Right.
So I liked fountain pens. And so when I started looking, I was interested. I just started checking out the Acme pens when I started working. I was just like curious to look at them. And then I saw the fountain pens and I was like, oh, that's cool. Because I was like thinking about getting a second one because I was using it all the time. And I was curious like what else they had because I knew they had both. And actually, I think I
Right.
kind of started collecting them a little bit. Like I have some of the old ones that are like discontinued and like theoretically are worth some amount of money, but I don't know who's going to buy them necessarily. But I have some cool ones.
Right. But was there something about I'm sort of trying to get at, like, did you just like the way they write or something? You make
Oh,
it
okay.
sound
All
like
right.
it's sort of
Like
arbitrary that you just
yeah,
started collecting them.
all right. You want to go into
Yes, you're
the depth. Okay. I thought we were
why
just in
why do
the,
you love fountain
okay.
pens?
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
That
in
is
my
fair.
case, there was a surgeon and attending that when I was a resident that everyone looked up to, and he used a he pulls a pilot vanishing point out of his pocket, and they were talking about the Fountain Pen Hospital, and he was talking about Pilot Namikis, and that always stuck with me because I think when you're a journeyman and there's a preceptor that everyone looks up to,
Mm,
then what he's using is going to leave a memory on me. Is that something that you noticed as well? Are there a lot of lawyers that use fountain pens, or were there some partners that used them?
Nope. It was just solely my own decision to explore it. I guess what I so I'm in like that last generation that had to handwrite exam or one of the last generations in the handwriting of exams, right?
Hmm.
And like when I was a kid, like we're talking fifth through maybe like seventh grade, something like that, right? They would give you those blue books, the little blue books, and you would have to write in them with erasable ballpoints. So essentially, what would happen is there would be, a 40-minute to a 2 hour period where you're writing an essay in a book and you're using like that erasable ballpoint
Right.
stuff from
Those are
Papermate,
horrible.
and your hand would be covered in ink and it would hurt from having to press into the cheap paper the whole time.
Horrible
And
experience.
so uh what ended up happening was like I love writing, but I still remember those experiences. So I think part of what happened was when I got into the professional world, I just really enjoyed myself, like the feeling of writing with a fountain pen. And I don't know if either of you have had this experience where like you kind of start out with something and it's enjoyable, and then you like hit upon like a pen or two where just you're like, oh my gosh, like I can't even believe
No,
this
no, it
right
almost,
now.
I like the way that it almost writes itself. Like I'm amazed that sometimes it seems like words come out that aren't
Yeah,
even the word that I meant to write. It has this sort of magical way, and it doesn't hurt your hands
yeah.
when you write with it the way that, you have to press down with a ballpoint pen. So I get that entirely. I mean, that's a big shift from collecting to fixing pens. Right.
So a couple things about me. I always liked, even though I like am, will call me like, my career is sort of like a white collar worker type career. I always liked doing things hands-on no matter what. I liked learning about how things work, and I could get into something or how things happen, like that whole, that putting things together. I've always really appreciated art and stuff like that. So for me, I think that I was like cooking. So a lot of time I was cooking, right? That was like a
Mhm.
really nice therapeutic hands-on thing. I'll tell you, like sometimes it's like great to just sit down and do a Lego set with the kids. Even though they're quite expensive now. Um, but nonetheless, I always enjoy those types of things. So
You're a maker. You like to make things and
yeah, I don't know. I don't see,
thinker.
I never really made things. I did a lot of
Fix
art
things, maybe.
classes and stuff when I was younger. And actually I did quite well in graphic design and communication. I was a
Mhm.
journalism major and I had to do a graphic design class or two in school in journalism school. And I did quite well in graphic design. So
Mhm.
I liked that. But I think for me, it just worked out that it was just like a natural extension that, there's these things that get acquired. However, there's also the possibility to work with it, work with your hands. And, I would say some of it is nice to just say, to be able to say for yourself, like, oh, I am, you know, happy to, be a, like, I'm happy to have made this myself. Like it's that much more special because it has a part of you in it. So I think that's kind of like how I moved into it. And it never really felt like I was making a huge jump because I always really enjoyed doing it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, obviously there's frustrating moments like with anything, as Richard once told me, you're gonna break a pen at some point, right?
Mhm.
But overall, the experience is usually pretty great. And, one of the things that's kind of amazing is just the community that you get to experience now around doing pen shows and events and things like that. I was in Paper Mouse in Boston on Saturday, and
Mhm.
like people brought me too many coffees. Like everyone knows I drink a lot of coffee at these things because I don't really eat, but like I get caffeinated up in the morning and it's just like, let's go. and I'm chatting and blah blah blah, the whole thing. Anyway, I had too many coffees because I bought myself a coffee, but then people kept bringing me coffee.
They're so
So, but like
nice. No,
that's
they're
like it's
very
such a
nice.
nice thing is that like, just people care about you. Like they want, people always offer to help, people are always, even if I'm running late, they're like, "Oh, do you need a break?" And I'm like, "No, let's get going. I'm running late." But it's so
No,
nice that they do that, and so
yeah,
like,
fountain pen people are really nice. And then the other thing
yeah.
is that you get. I'm just riffing on what you're saying. I find it amazing that you can know fairly quickly, still because it's still a very small community, that you can know Jonathan Brooks. Who's probably the best known person who makes. The
Hmm.
resins for fountain pens. You can talk
Yeah.
to him. You can talk to Richard Bender. You can talk to all these people who are the best known people in fountain pens that you can go to a pen show and talk to the head of distribution at
Yeah.
Pelican. It's fairly small, so you
Yeah.
you really don't, it's there's, you can't really do that with cars. I mean, in the sense that, you're not going to get to talk to the head of Ford Motors or,
Yeah.
or get to, so there's something really fantastic about not just having a fountain pen, but actually in many cases having a pen that who made it, Sean Design and being
Yeah.
able to talk to them and see the pens they're making. I think
I
that's really
mean,
great. Yeah.
I think that part of what sustains the fountain pen community is that dynamic in the sense that if you are able to like learn the story behind your product, it is that much more special, right? Like I say your product, I mean the product you're gonna consider buying, right?
Hmm.
Like if you could know why somebody even just designed it the way they did, it becomes that much more um emotion you have much it's much easier to connect on an emotional level. And I think, that's like probably just brilliant marketing on a certain level, just playing itself out. But it is something that I think, brings people into it and makes it feel less like you're just buying a fungible object like you would, say, a sweater at the Gap,
Hmm.
like think of it like what has to happen for you to become like attached to
Right. Well, I
article of
don't,
clothing,
I'm
you
sure
know?
that there are similar things that people collect, probably watches. There are
Yeah,
different things that have some aspects of it, but and then also that it actually, it does its thing. It writes, and
yeah.
to me, that's sometimes a bit of the frustrating part. So much in terms
Explain
of the
that to me.
connection
I'm curious what
with
you
an
mean by
art
that.
historian is. I feel that I'm not sure this would be in the interview, but I feel that the fountain pen community is not interested. I wish they were more interested in a way about, what fountain pens do, how they, if they're used to write, how do they change the way you write, or how, you know, so if you're looking at the history of fountain pens and most books about fountain pens history,
Hmm.
they just really just focus on sort of technological change, right? They don't ask the question, well, how does the fact that you're not dipping a pen, but you're writing it now and you don't have to wait to dip it, or how did that actually change the way people write? And there is a lot, quite, for example, there's quite a lot of a literature about how the
Hmm.
typewriter changed the way people
Hmm.
write, or how the computer changed the way
Yeah.
people write. You don't quite see the equivalent same thing with how fountain
That's
pens
part
have
of
changed.
the I think that's part of the wide appeal to fountain pens too, is you have different people, different sects of people who are interested in different things. Some people like maker
Hmm.
pens, and
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
really like the nibs and the technology. I think a lot of the Boston pen people, I saw a news interview with some of them, and they talked about cursive writing, and they have a real effort to teach cursive writing to school kids. So they do like volunteer outreach, and they give fountain pens to kids.
Right.
Hmm.
And they talk about the fact that if you're not taught calligraphy in school, you're not going to be able to read the Declaration of Independence
Well,
because
that's an interesting thing from a
yeah,
historical standpoint, but I was just thinking about how you think. Does it actually change the way you think when you write with a
yeah.
pen
They
versus
talk a
how
lot
you
too
how you
about the
type?
way that the
Yeah.
brain communicates with the hand, how that's a more
Yeah. Yeah. I
fluid
think that's
connection
interesting.
than the brain
Um,
connecting with the keyboard.
And then to me, I've tried to focus a lot on designers, I think it's kind of frustrating that often when you look at the history of fountain pens, you don't the actual person who designed the pen isn't known or isn't really talked about. And I think,
Hmm.
try to try to focus so much. That's one of the things I like about Lamy is that they, approached all these really famous designers. And then there are really some really interesting designers in the history of fountain pens, which I think is kind of
Yeah.
fascinating.
Well, I
Anyway,
mean,
coming back to you, um, uh, amazing stories. Do you have like funny stories about people bringing you strange pens and um, weird
Like
requests?
requests, can you make a like a triple stack architect nib or any like
well,
experience?
I don't do stacking. That other people do it. I'm not a nib stacker. Um, there was once upon a time, there might still be, there was like a nib maker, nib people's Discord channel, and it was like half the people were just cutting up nibs and stacking them, and the other half were like the nib folks you'd be familiar with for the most part from shows. And it was just that they were like alchemists compared to what I do. I'm sort of, like your typical artisan, and they're like thinking like, oh, how could we, it's just a totally different thing. I just never got into it. Um, but I guess I don't know. Most people ask for reasonable stuff. Like it's hard to, I can't think of something that was like so bizarre that, it was
I
just
I remember
out of
you once saying
control.
to me, I mean, I haven't brought that many pens to you, but I remember you once said to me, I think it was I don't remember why exactly, but you said something about it was a Pilot Custom 823, and you said, oh, it writes so. I had two of them, and I
Yeah.
was going to maybe have you turn the broad into an italic or something like that, and you said something about how, well, actually, they write so beautifully. You should just keep it, and get another
Yeah.
one or something. And doesn't that happen from time to time that someone
Yes.
brings you a
Okay.
beautiful nib and they want you to operate on it, and you're saying, no, no, I don't want to do it because it's such a beautiful nib.
I mean, I generally, I sometimes say that. I usually say that if somebody is waffling or
Right,
not waffling, but not sure what to do. I'm usually like, well, this is great on its own.
right.
Don't you think that, just hang on to it. You could always have it modified another day. I would say, I mean, I guess I see so many nibs, and I really do think like the pilot broads and the double broad and the C nib are like things of beauty, and it just if you have one, there's nothing, unless the only usually people will tell me why they want to modify something,
Mhm.
you know, in the sense that like they'll tell me it just is too much blobbiness. Like a lot of folks, I think, want, for various reasons, want a more refined line than what, broads and above provide. And so that leads to, I think, more overall popularity for certain things, and the requests you get sort of are in line with that. So cursive italics and architects, right, have, depending on each one of those, one stroke is finer and then one stroke is wider. And so you get kind of like that beautiful sort of like curviness to the writing depending on what you're doing. And so that kind of refinement, I think a lot of people want that, and they want it at all steps of the spectrum. So fine, extra fine nibs, medium, broad, all the big one, the bigger than broad, we'll call it. And, I get it because that, is something that's very hard for a manufacturer of nibs to achieve efficiently. So even like when you look at the calligraphy nibs from Lamy or Cueco, or the so-called stubs from Bach and Yovo, and now some of the Chinese brands have them. what that really just is like a rounded piece of metal. But that there's really not much you can do with that other than just to make it more cursive, make it more
Hmm.
italic than it already is. But for them to do that is going to be a lot more complicated than they're willing to do for a nib that they sell to manufacturers for a few dollars a
Hmm.
piece
Right.
or less, depending on who we're talking about here and what we're talking about. So it's hard for the fountain pen buying world to get some of these things done in a way that works for them. I will say Sailor does cut the music nib a little sharper, and they've even made it sharper than it was. So you might get more of that, but that is not. It's still not like what I would say to you is like a cursive nib in the sense that that's like what it's designed to do. Um,
So
so
what you're saying
you
is
know,
to get a nib really, a refined cursive nib, you really have to go to someone like you to make something that really is custom made for the person.
yeah, I should define what I mean by refine because I realize I've
Right.
used it several times and now you're adopting that term. So, so like if you think of say like this is like your generic medium nib, whether it's in a Twisby, an Esterbrook, a Leonardo,
Let's take a Jovo medium nib.
yeah, Joe
Okay.
nib,
Right.
Franklin Christoph, right? You know, it's designed to write the same line no matter which way you're moving the nib, right?
Right.
And um, it sort of just puts down a line. And people have, and it's again, it's like at all levels of the spectrum. When I talk about refinement, I mean cleaning, like giving you something much more clean looking in the sense that like it looks like almost like quill. Like, so if you
Hmm.
think about how quills were cut in the old days, right? So if you, and I say clean, but maybe that's not even right because, if you think of old letters, you see like the ink drops from
Hmm.
like the dipping of the quill or something like that. But I kind of mean it in that sense. Like it gives you sort of like this very classic handwriting because you have thin to thick to thin to thick, and
But
it's
isn't that a
not a
function
blob.
also of isn't that a function of the fact that a quill is actually flexes a bit? It's gonna of any quill that you
Does
cut.
it flex
Oh yeah, I
like a
actually have a
feather?
close friend who teaches his students, Andrew Raftery actually teaches his students to cut quills. Oh sure,
Yeah.
a quill pen will flex.
Okay. Well, in what I mean simply is that it has a much more clean, it has a cleaner look.
Okay.
And I guess what I find is that people who write, you know, who want the refined look, anything that's sort of rounded is going to look a little blobby. Does that
I
make
see.
sense?
Yes,
So
yeah.
they want to get it sort of into this. It's not, I mean, a little bit in the calligraphy sense. I don't know. It's hard for me to articulate. I call it refined because it usually is when someone talks to me and they're writing and they're showing me and they're like, this is just there's no personality. Maybe that's the word for it. They want more
That's a nice
personality,
way of thinking about it. No, I know
but
exactly what you mean.
yeah, but
And
it's
I
like a
think some
refinement of the personality of the writing, I
right.
guess is
And I
that's what
think some pens that are, that people love, like the Lamy 2000, is that for whatever reason, I'm not quite sure what they do, but it just comes that way. The Lamy 2000, the stock medium Lamy 2000 writes with this just beautiful way. But I recently got a Lamy 2000 with what they call OB nib,
yeah,
and it's extremely like what you're talking about. It
yeah,
just you see the difference, and it's just this thick, ugly kind of line that it lays down for
yeah.
whatever reason. I'm not quite sure. They call it, I guess it's meant for a left-handed person to write broad. I don't know why it
It's meant for
writes like that.
rotating. So the idea is that it's at an angle. So you
Right.
rotate it. Here we go. You've been waiting for the nib to come out, right?
Yeah,
Ugh,
yeah, but unlike an italic nib, normally that should have a little bit of whatever you're calling refinement. Instead,
yeah,
at least the one that I have is an extreme version of what you're talking about. It just
yeah.
is thick and
It's
almost writes like a magic marker. It's
yeah,
terrible.
no, it's thick. It's big. That's
It's
people.
big
That's
and ugly. It makes your handwriting actually look ugly, I think.
you mean
So
it lacks refinement.
it lacks refinement, which is why, Yeah, you don't want, I think even, a boring metropolitan is going to make your handwriting look more personal than if you write with a, Sharpie, you
Yeah.
know?
So I
Yes.
think you're getting what I'm saying
Yes.
is that
Definitely.
it refinement, personality, like it adds something that is not there intrinsically in the design. Like it needs to be brought out in some
But
way.
also it's beautiful because in a way you're doing something quite creative. So you're
Yeah.
bringing that refinement to pens that sort of are almost like your material that you then take to the next level.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
think about, if like if money is no object, like what would you want to do with it, right? You would want something that is from top to bottom absolutely bespoke. And you would want just like if you had money was no object, you were buying a car that you could customize in any way,
Mhm.
right? It's the same thing with pens. You want this pen to write a way that you like dream or that you imagine this is going to
Mhm.
look like. And there is, I mean, for some people it is a real utility, right? Like there's a utility basis for why they're asking for it, whether it's they do calligraphy and they want something that's going to kind of
Mhm.
get them there, or you're talking about people who are, you know, have a use case that lends itself to very fine nibs, very sharp nibs, whatever it is. I see a lot of different things, and my overall sense for the last several years is that a lot of people obviously want personality, but like it is like this refinement concept that I'm trying to articulate
Mhm.
is a big part of it. And getting back to kind of what you were saying, Jonathan, a few minutes ago about the idea of like what does the fountain pen do to your handwriting? I think actually, you could poo-poo social media and some of these things a lot, but actually that's where you go to see what some of this does for people in terms of both
Mhm.
their usage and what it looks like and how it, how and even how it helps them formulate part of this into their identity, right? Because it's like it becomes part of the self-expression is how are you writing? What are you writing with? And so it's kind of interesting to be a part of the process for that because you're helping people create like if you were going to get a custom suit that you wanted to be look very particular because you wanted to say something very particular about you, some sort of vintage or retro attribute that kind of harkens back to it, right? Like I love vests. You could look at vests as being kind of cartoon costumey, but I like it. It's like to me it's like a nice classic thing to kind of introduce to
Now,
your
do
your
different nib tune their pens in such a way that you can tell the difference between one that you've done versus someone else?
um So I would, all right, you're gonna love this answer. You in particular, you're gonna love this. I can't wait to actually tell you this. So you can think of at this time period, you could think of like the community of nib people as almost coming from different schools in
Right.
the old sense of that, in the old
Definitely.
artisanal sense of that. So, for example, I come from the school of Binder
Hmm.
where Richard wanted to figure out how to grind or how to modify nibs and developed methodology based on examining vintage nibs and then formulating a methodology and experimenting and over time developing like, kind of a process that he then taught Linda, he taught to me, he taught to a couple other people, and we go with that. Then you have some of the people who say learn from John Mateshaw or Mike Matsuyama, and they
Hmm.
follow this kind of Japanese methodology because that's sort of the techniques that they learned from. Matthew Chen, who you might have encountered, learned from Nagahara and Matsuyama. So he also comes from it. And you could see the difference primarily just like surface wise on the way the tools people select, right?
Hmm.
So basically, if you look at the Japanese methodology, it's usually tools that are spinning. It's some sort of drum with abrasives and it spins. And they kind of shape along that spinning cylinder.
Hmm.
I use a spinning cylinder somewhat, but I use a rotary tool because this is the way Richard showed me what he does. And it's at an angle, and we make cuts with a diamond wheel, which is like a flat frisbee shaped object. And then we use the oxide drum to do some of the rounding, similar to our Japanese school friends. But it's just a different approach. I'll get back to your answer and like to the specific answer in a second. The third school I would say was the people who sort of were picked things up on their own. They didn't necessarily have someone that showed them everything or showed them partially, and so they developed their own methodology, and you kind of see that. And so it's
Hmm.
hybrids, it's different things. It's just. So, and I'm not saying that one is better than the other or that you should you should doubt or because they're all achieving the same thing, right? But it's just a different set of steps for how you get there, right? So, with that in mind, to answer your specific question is I can typically tell obviously the stuff that comes from the other folks that are not Richard and Linda. Sometimes I look at Richard and Linda's nibs and I'm not sure if it was mine, and I'll be like, "Did I do this for you?" But it basically aligns that way. And then the other thing is that there's certain manufacturers that actually grind their own nibs. They make pens and they grind their own nibs, and
Right.
so sometimes they come from direct from the company. So like I know Leonardo does a number of their own grinds. If you see on their website, or you see sometimes through the vendor that you can get like a Leonardo cursive italic. That is something ground by Salva, or I think it's Salva, the owner of Leonardo. Sean Newton sells grinds with his pens that he's doing. So,
Right.
Brian Gray also of Edison is also taught by Richard. So he does again. I mean, Brian Gray is because he's making pens is so deep into it that, he's like, he once showed me he ran all these experiments on a feed and had like diagrams. I mean, it's really interesting, but I'm getting a little far afield. So basically, yes, I can look at I will know certain things. And
No, it makes
like,
totally sense. So to sort of divide it into different schools,
yeah.
and also I would imagine that, some a particular school might be more emphasizing smoothness versus
Hmm.
feedback, or perhaps, I don't know, there might be some
So
particular idea of what an ideal nib should be like. Because so many
yeah,
people don't know what they want, really, right?
yeah. I mean, a lot of the issues that you'll see come from sometimes just how the finishing is done, and there's little, when someone comes to you, and this doesn't happen a lot, so I don't want to overstate the problem, but every now and then someone comes to me and says, I had this ground and it's just not working for me. And so we kind of I look at what's gone on. And, nobody's perfect. I'm sure some of my
No,
nibs are better than other
no,
people,
and also no.
you know.
Often it's what's used for. Early in this process for me, I bought a Pilot 743 that had been ground so they could do Spencerian writing, right?
Yeah.
I imagined that that would be perfect as an artist, and I would be able to do really fine lines and
Mhm.
everything. And I hated it. I mean, I thought it was actually ruined, that somebody had
Yeah.
ruined the pen, right? Because I couldn't imagine that anybody would want a pen to write
Yeah. No, it can
that
be very
unsmoothly,
uncomfortable.
right? And then I
Yeah.
brought it actually to several. I showed it. I might have even showed it to you. I showed it to a few different people and said, "No, no, no, this is exactly right. This is." And
Yeah.
I'm blanking on the. It's one of the people that you mentioned
Yeah.
actually did it, and I sold it on eBay and actually was able to, I think, get more money for it than what I paid for.
Yeah. I
But it was
mean,
an example of a pen that wasn't made for me. That wasn't, I bought it from eBay. It said that it had been ground in this
yeah.
particular way, and I thought that that's what I wanted, but it isn't what I wanted. So
Well,
that's different.
let
Yeah.
me let me add to that
Yeah.
experience a couple of insights on that. So the first is, at some point, right, if you are trying to create like a true Spencerian nib, the Spencerian nib is extremely fine. It's extremely
Right.
pointy. You're never going to be able to get that really smooth if you're doing it on a fountain pen because you have to almost like leave like a blade edge on the tipping. So that's my first insight with that. And my second insight with that is I put those types of things in um the category of the use and result of it is more important than the experience of using it sometimes, in the sense that and I guess I'm really speaking about the comfort level, the
Well,
comfiness,
yeah.
you know. So like when I did the Charles Schultz nib that I tried to mimic the Radio 914 from Esterbrook,
Mhm.
I almost could not care. I wrote with the 914, I tested it. I could not care at all about the um how smooth it was, because it was all about making it the nib that could draw Charlie Brown the way Charles Schultz did.
Right.
And the
Well,
way it was explained to me
Maurice
by his
Sendak used
studio.
to Maurice Sendak used a dip pen, right?
Yeah,
And he used the little speed what now Speedball makes them, that Hunt used to
yeah,
make the nibs. And that was completely uncomfortable. I personally would never write with that kind of a nib.
yeah,
It's absolutely sharp. If you don't know
yeah,
what you're doing, you're going to pick up pieces of paper when you do it. I mean, he didn't.
yeah,
He knew how to use it, but it's
yeah,
not a pen that is created for comfort in that sense. It's meant
yeah.
to make an incredibly fine cross-hatched line.
But
That's why
that's
it's created. Yeah.
when they grind the Spencerian, they're thinking of it in the same terms.
Exactly. They would never
Not
occur to
really.
them. Yeah,
Yeah,
no. And also you get used to it. It becomes your tool.
yeah,
I'm not thinking, in fact, when I use a brush, particularly as a painter, about comfort in the same
yeah.
way that I am when I'm
Yep.
writing. So it's
Yep.
interesting. And also, of course, people have very different expectations about comfort.
Yeah.
What about favorite pens? What are your favorite pens?
Oh, I'm happy to talk about that. So, all right.
And do you have
So,
any pens to show us?
I mean, I showed you my jail pen. That's a big one. What do I have? Let me grab. So, I have been really grooving on Schaefer broad nips recently. Just
Okay.
not like I have the new I could show you the new Legacy, which is pretty rad, but this is like a what's it called? A Schaefer Imperial cartridge filler. I don't know exactly from when, if it's from the 60s, the 90s, I don't really know. But the nib on this thing is just out of control. Kind of see it there, right? So I love the aesthetics of this era of Schaefer, like the metal cap, the
Hmm.
plastic barrel and section, the inlaid nib. Like, to me, this is totally, and I put it out there also for folks that are hesitant to get into the more, we'll call it not complicated, but the little more high maintenance vintage filling systems, but want to experience. And actually, I wanted to say tonight something that in line with this, which is that there are a lot of different ways to experience vintage pens, and the one of the main reasons to do it is because you're going to get a writing experience like you can't get from anything else, right? Like they just don't make them like they used to. Even, like the Mont Blanc nips are different than what they used to be,
Hmm.
which is fine. We need to be realistic in a lot of ways about all of this stuff. But nonetheless, it is an opportunity to broaden your horizons and get something that's not just a stock nib. And I can tell you, like, you can get these types of Schaefer pens in a variety of nib sizes. And if you don't like broads, you're in even better shape, because the mediums, the fines, all of those are like way more ubiquitous than the broad nibs, and therefore they cost less. So you could theoretically try a vintage pen with like a true vintage nib for like $30, And
Hmm.
so, you're not, an ASV now costs $35 or $28, right? So,
Well, you mentioned the Esterbrook. You said that was one of the first things that
yeah,
you did. You put a sack in, right? And
yeah,
I actually, weirdly, I don't know, a few years ago in the middle of the night, somebody sold for very little money, for like $300, their entire collection of
Yeah,
Esterbrook pens in the 50s, and then I have, it's fascinating with all the different nibs that you could buy, and and they
yeah,
still, because they were so well made, they just didn't
yeah,
they just kept going, that you can get those pens for still 20, $30.
yeah.
And then you're right, the shaver pens. I mean, there is, that's another part about the community. I shouldn't be so judgy about it, because in a way certain people are also judgy, but there are a lot of people within the fountain pen community who kind of feel that, once World War II happened, then fountain pens were no longer interesting. And then
I mean
I'm a
that,
great believer. I love pens from the 50s and 60s.
yeah. I mean, that
I like
view
it
is
all.
somewhat preposterous.
Right.
That there's nothing interesting after that. I get that there's an artistry to some of the pens that they're talking about from
Yes.
the 1910s through the 1930s, up into the war. However, however, there is also brilliant things happening. You talk about designers, right? Like there
Right.
were industrial designers brought in, they were competing with each other. And the pens were well made because they were in competition with each other. So they
Right.
wanted to have that. And I guess, I'm one of those people that thinks everyone should diversify. You could like all of it. You can say, like I'll tell you, I buy a fair number of Leonardo pens. I think they're
Mm.
made well made. I've been to the factory, so I can tell you, like things are not coming from China. The clips are made
Mhm.
there. They're stamped out by a machine. Like I actually got to operate it just for like a
Oh,
couple.
cool.
And the ring, the cap rings, all that stuff is made there. Jonathan
You know what I
Weinberg,
notice that gets a lot of people interested is if the seller says, "Oh, this pen was custom ground by JJ Lax Company or
really?
Richard Bender."
Yeah, no, no, I hear I get what you're all saying. I didn't know that kind of bumps up the price.
Oh, no, no, definitely. Definitely does. Definitely does bump up the price.
Yeah, Josh, I think you kind of hinted at it that you do have a lot of steel nibs. So it sounds like really a good quality steel nib is going to be just as good for a writer as any sort of gold nib.
Yeah, I mean, the experience, right? So steel is harder than gold, I believe. And, depending on the gold nib, it might absorb some of the vibrations, so you get a smoother feel. But at the end of the day, it is like the finishing of the nib because any sort of hard edge it's going to catch in the fibers of the paper was going to cause someone to notice it at some point. Some people like a little bit of feedback, and some makers do it. People will tell you I don't want glassy smooth. I like to know the paper's there. But it's really all about the finishing at the end of it. Although, I mean, it is like a big number 8 gold nib, a big king of pen nib. They are something different, obviously, than like a Yovo number 6 steel nib. Um, I think to me the one of the more interesting things is with vintage pens when they use different materials. Like I always found the British tipping on the gold nibs to feel different than the American,
Mm.
in a way that I kind of like. I can't really explain that to you because I've never really researched like what the differences are. But I don't know, I always gravitate towards the British nibs as opposed to some of the American vintage nibs. I feel like there's like a different experience to be had. Um, haven't really written with all that much of the vintage Japanese nibs, nor could I really tell you what well, some of the old German nibs definitely. I have, yeah, and some of the older Italian nibs are
But
just
often I
gorgeous.
think when people
But
talk about steel nibs, they generalize too much. Because I was just thinking about how
yeah,
Pelican, the M200 series, which is kind of so common, right? But Pelican steel nibs really, right, they have a kind of slight bounciness to them
yeah,
that really is much different from a Jovo nib, for
yeah.
example,
I
right?
mean,
So,
this is the new legacy that came out last year from
ah,
Schaefer. It's the Indian company William Penn owns them.
right.
Anyway, they re-engineered the inlaid nib, and
Oh,
it's steel, So it's the old legacy was always gold, but now it's
Right.
steel. And it's got, for a steel nib, it's got some play. Like it's a
Ah,
really nice experience. And so, and that's just how they finished it, right? And how it's designed. So it's not the material, it's what you do with it, I guess.